The chipped formica of the diner booth felt slick under Frank Banning's forearms. The 3:17 a.m. special 4D black coffee and a day old apple pie, foo, did little to cut through the residue of the meeting. Union Rep Barry Stern had been digging in, predictably, over shift differentials and the new automated loading docks. Frank, as floor manager at the port of Beaumont, had been tasked with softening the blow. It never was softening. It was damage control. "Look, Barry," ED said, leaning forward, his voice roughened by too many cigarettes and too little sleep. "I am not saying I like it. My dad walked those docks for 30 years. But this is happening. We can negotiate for retraining, for severance packages. We just can't stop progress." Barry hadn't bought it. He hadn't bought any of it. Frank knew the man, knew the glacial pace of trust earned, and the swiftness with which it could be lost. He finally sidestepped a full-blown walkout by promising to push for a review of the automation plan in 6 months. A promise he knew might not be worth the paper it was written on. He took a large gulp of coffee, the bitterness a welcome contrast to the saccharine sweetness of the pie. He barely touched the diner. The Port City Grill was a Beaumont institution, all chrome and vinyl and the lingering smell of grease. It was open 24/7, catering to the rotating shifts of the port and the insomniacs who populated this corner of Texas. It was also, Frank thought, a good place to disappear for a while. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Old Man Hemmings, retiring head mechanic. "Need a favor, Frank. Mustang appraisal. Old girl deserves a good send-off. Your expertise appreciated." Frank sighed. Hemmings was a good man, a relic of a time when things were built to last. And Frank, despite the creeping exhaustion, did know cars. He'd spent half his youth under the hood of his father. He's 67 Impala, learning the language of engines and the satisfaction of a perfectly timed ignition. It was a useful skill, one he occasionally used to supplement his income, squirreling away a little extra for a future that felt increasingly uncertain. "All right, Hemmings," he muttered, texting back. "Name the time and place." The reply was instant. "Barn tomorrow afternoon. 6:00. Bring a flashlight." The barn smelled of dust and hay and something else. A faint, metallic tang that Frank could quite place. Hemmings, a wiry man with hands permanently stained with grease, was beaming as he threw open the barn doors, revealing a cherry. Red 1967 Mustang fastback. It wasn't pristine, not by a long shot. Decades of neglect had dulled the paint and speckled the chrome with rust, but beneath the grime, Frank could see the promise of something spectacular. "She hasn't run in 15 years, Hemmings said, stroking the Mustang's hood with an almost reverent touch. "But the engine's solid. Always kept it covered, oiled it religiously. Just never got around to restoring her. She is beautiful, Hemmings," Frank said, meaning it. He ran a hand along the curved fender, appreciating the lines of the classic car, a real piece of history. "That is what I told my wife. Bless her soul, said I was obsessed with a hunk of metal, but she understood. This car, it reminded me of my youth." Hemmings paused, a faraway look in his eyes. "Appraise it fairly, Frank. I want it to go to someone who'll appreciate her." Frank spent the next 2 hours meticulously examining the Mustang. He checked the engine, the chassis, the interior. He noted every ding, every scratch, every worn part. He'd done enough appraisals to know what to look for, what details would affect the value. The car was rough, but the underlying quality was undeniable. It would need a significant investment to restore it, but it was a worthwhile project. As he was finishing up, he noticed something odd, a slight unevenness in the headliner, above the driver's seat. He felt around, his fingers tracing the fabric. It gave way, revealing a small, expertly concealed compartment. "What is this?" he said, more to himself than to Hemmings. "Shh." He reached inside, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. It was a small steel box, no larger than a deck of cards. A tiny padlock secured the lid. "Never seen that before," Hemmings said, turning around. He squinted at the box. Must have been hidden by the previous owner. Bought the car from old man Abernathy back in '82. Eccentric fellow. Used to be a smuggler, or so the rumors went. Frank shrugged, feeling a prickle of unease. Probably just some old tools or keepsakes. He tried to open the padlock, but it wouldn't budge. He didn't have the tools to break it open without damaging the box. "I'll take it with me," he said. "Find a way to open it later." Hemmings shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just glad you could take a look at the Mustang." Back at his small, two-bedroom house on the edge of town, Frank set the box on his kitchen table. He stared at it, a strange fascination creeping over him. It was an anomaly, a discordant note in the otherwise mundane task he'd undertaken. He tried the padlock again, jiggling it, applying pressure. Nothing. Finally, he grabbed a small screwdriver from his toolbox and carefully pried at the latch. It snapped open with a faint click. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, tarnished bullet. A .45 caliber, judging by its size. Frank frowned. What the hell? Beneath the bullet, he found a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, the ink faded. He unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling slightly. The message was short, stark and chilling. "Time is running out." He read it again, and again. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with menace. He glanced around the kitchen, suddenly aware of the shadows lengthening in the corners. It had to be a joke, he told himself. A prank left by Abernathy, the rumoured smuggler. It was a strange, unsettling joke, but a joke nonetheless. He was tired, that was all. The late night at the diner, the hours spent examining the Mustang, the lingering stress from the union negotiations. It was all getting to him. He needed to relax, to clear his head. He tossed the note on the table and turned on the television, flipping through channels. Empty reality shows and blaring commercials filled the room, but they couldn't drown out the nagging voice in the back of his mind. He picked up the bullet, turning it over in his fingers. It felt cold, heavy. The metal was worn smooth, as though it had been handled many times. It wasn't just a bullet, it was a threat. He glanced back at the note. "Time is running out." He tried to dismiss the feeling, to convince himself it was paranoia. But something felt profoundly wrong. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He looked out the kitchen window into the dark street. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. But as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His phone vibrated again. Another text message, this time from an unknown number. It simply read, "They know." The chipped ceramic of Frank's coffee mug warmed his hands, a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep in his bones. Sleep had been a restless visitor, haunted by the tarnished bullet and the cryptic messages. He spent the early hours of the morning, lost in online rabbit holes, tracing the Mustang VIN number, hoping to find some explanation for the hidden box and its ominous contents. The car's history was complicated. It hadn't passed through many hands. The original owner, back in 1967, was a local businessman, but in 1978 it was sold to Alistair Croft, who'd been the plant manager at Beaumont Steel, the same plant Frank now managed a footy until his abrupt retirement in 1987. Croft's name sparked a buried memory, a flicker of anger. He'd been a hard man. Croft, ruthless, some said. He'd made a lot of enemies during the tumultuous labor disputes of the late 70s and early 80s. Frank remembered whispers about backroom deals, union busting, and a willingness to sacrifice workers to protect the bottom line. A wave of nausea rolled over him, a visceral reaction to the resurfacing memories. He closed his eyes, and the past flooded back, unbidden and brutal. The air hung thick with rain and smoke in November 1987. Beaumont Steel was a battleground. Faces grim and determined marched in endless circles, picket signs held high. Frank, barely 22, fresh out of college and fueled by idealism, walked with them. He wasn't a line worker, not yet. He was a junior engineer, a liaison between management and the floor, trying to bridge a widening chasm. Croft had announced sweeping cuts, automation, layoffs, a complete restructuring of benefits. It was a death sentence for the town, a gut punch to the working class. The union, led by Frank's own father, a grizzled veteran named Leo Banning, had called a strike. Frank had believed he could make a difference. He'd crunched the numbers, prepared alternative proposals, argued for concessions. He'd tried to reason with Croft, to appeal to his sense of decency. Croft hadn't listened. Sentimentality has no place in business. Banning, he'd sneered, his eyes cold and dismissive. These workers are expendable. We need to modernize, to compete. The strike dragged on, weeks bleeding into months. Tensions escalated. Scabs were hired, families were torn apart, and violence simmered beneath the surface. Frank, torn between loyalty to his father and his obligation to the company, found himself increasingly isolated. He remembered one night vividly. A confrontation at the plant gates. Shouting, shoving, then a rock thrown, shattering a window. Chaos erupted. He tried to intervene, to pull two workers apart, and ended up taking a fist to the face, sending him sprawling into the muddy ground. His father, witnessing the event, had rushed to his side, his face a mask of fury. The strike ended badly. Croft prevailed. Hundreds were laid off. Leo Banning, broken and defeated, retired early. His faith in the system shattered. Frank had stayed on at the plant, guilt gnawing at his insides, a silent testament to the brutal realities of corporate power. The memory of his father's disappointment, the simmering resentment of his former comrades, had haunted him ever since. Frank shuddered, dragging himself back to the present. The coffee had gone cold. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the ghosts of '87. Croft had been gone for decades, but his legacy lingered, a dark shadow over Beaumont Steel. The feeling of being watched intensified. He arrived at the plant early. Before the morning shift, everything seemed normal, but a subtle unease prickled at the back of his neck. He started his usual walk through, checking the loading docks, the production lines, the security systems. That is when he noticed the first discrepancy. A set of precision wrenches, essential for calibrating the new automated loaders, were missing from the tool crib. Old man Hemmings was meticulous about inventory. Something wasn't right. Anything happened last night? Night shift? He asked Maria Rodriguez, the shift supervisor. A sharp woman who ran a tight ship. Nothing out of the ordinary, Frank, she replied, her brow furrowed. Just the usual glitches with the new system. Foreman Davis said one of the loaders was running a little slow, but he recalibrated it. Frank made a note to check the loader logs. As the shift progressed, more small incidents began to surface. A shipment of raw materials was delayed. A conveyor belt inexplicably jammed. A computer system briefly crashed. Individually, they were minor inconveniences. Collectively, they felt deliberate. He found Sal DeMarco during his lunch break, leaning against a stack of steel coils, smoking a cigarette. Sal was a lifetime union brother, a man Frank trusted with his life. They'd come up together, started on the line at the same time. Something's off, Sal, Frank said, keeping his voice low. Things are starting to go wrong. Small stuff, but it is adding up. Sal took a long drag from his cigarette. What kind of wrong? Frank recounted the missing wrenches, the delayed shipment, the malfunctioning equipment. He hesitated, then told Sal about the Mustang, the hidden box, and the note. Sal's face darkened. Time is running out. That is unsettling, Frank. Sounds like someone's trying to send a message. I thought so too, Frank said. And it feels connected to the plant, to what is happening here. Croft's ghost, maybe, or someone who remembers the strike. Sal exhaled a plume of smoke. Croft was a snake, made a lot of enemies. You were right in the thick of it back then, Frank. You think someone's holding a grudge? I don't know, Frank admitted, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being set up, that someone wants to see me fail. Let's not jump to conclusions, Sal said, but his voice lacked conviction. We'll keep an eye out, all right. Stick together. Frank nodded, grateful for Sal's support. As he walked back towards his office, a fleeting movement caught his eye. In the factory parking garage, partially obscured by the shadows of the loading bays, he saw a figure standing near his truck. The figure was tall, clad in a dark jacket, their face hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. They were just watching. Frank stopped, his heart pounding. He stared intently, trying to get a better look. But the figure vanished, seemingly melting into the shadows. He walked quickly to his truck, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He scanned the garage, but it was empty. He unlocked the door, slipped inside, and locked it. His hand trembling. As he started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror. He thought he saw a glint of light fit in, a reflection, perhaps Fiddy from the second story of the parking garage. And then he realized with a sickening lurch in his gut that the figure hadn't just been watching the garage. They'd been watching him. Someone knew about his past. Someone was deliberately targeting him, and whatever game they were playing, it was only just beginning. Call came just before dawn, shattering the fragile peace of Frank's sleep. It was Rodriguez, her voice tight with controlled panic. Frank, you need to get down here now. We almost had a catastrophe. He was dressed and halfway to Beaumont Steel before she'd finished explaining. A critical hydraulic press, used for shaping heavy metal components, had malfunctioned during the night shift. The safety mechanisms had failed, and a massive metal beam had come crashing down, missing a worker footing a young man named Kevin Bell, sooting by inches. Rodriguez said, her face pale as she met him at the accident site. Yellow tape cordoned off the area, and a team of engineers were already swarming around the damaged machine. Frank's gut twisted as he surveyed the scene. The press was a behemoth, its steel frame twisted and scarred. The beam lay on the concrete floor, a testament to the destructive power unleashed. What happened? He asked, his voice grim. Preliminary investigation suggests a sensor failure, Rodriguez replied. The proximity sensor, the one that detects obstructions and automatically shuts down the press. It was offline. Completely disabled. Frank knelt beside the sensor housing, examining the wiring. The wires hadn't simply come loose. They'd been deliberately severed, cleanly cut with a precision tool. This wasn't an accident, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Simonon tampered with this machine. The air thickened with tension. Sabotage. The word hung unspoken, but everyone present understood its weight. We need to shut down the entire line, Rodriguez said, her voice trembling, until we can be sure this doesn't happen again. Frank knew she was right, but a shutdown would be disastrous. Lost production, missed deadlines, potential contract cancellations. It could cripple the plant. He'd already been fielding worried calls from corporate. A major accident, coupled with further disruptions, could be the final nail in Beaumont Steel's coffin. All right, he said, finally, his jaw tight. Shut it down. But I want a full security review. Every camera, every access point. And I want a list of everyone who had access to this machine in the last 48 hours. The list wasn't long. Maintenance crew, engineers, a handful of senior technicians. One name stood out: Ben Carter, a skilled technician, a veteran of the plant. Carter had been passed over for a promotion to lead mechanic just last month. He'd been visibly disgruntled ever since. Frank remembered Carter as a meticulous worker, a quiet, intense man who took pride in his craft. But he also remembered the simmering resentment in his eyes after the promotion announcement. He'd made a pointed comment about the company rewarding loyalty over competence. He found Carter in the break room, staring into a cup of black coffee, his face shadowed. "Ben," Frank said, his voice carefully neutral, "I need to ask you about the press malfunction." Carter looked up, his eyes guarded. "Heard about it. Nasty business. Glad no one got hurt. The sensor was deliberately disabled. Ben, the wires were cut." Carter's jaw tightened. "That is a serious accusation, Frank. I'm just asking questions. You had access to the machine. You've worked on it before. So have a dozen other people." "It could have been anyone." Carter's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. "You were passed over for the lead mechanic position recently, weren't you?" A flicker of anger crossed Carter's face. "What has that got to do with anything? I was the most qualified candidate. They gave it to Peterson, a guy who has been here half the time and spends more time on his phone than on the job." "I understand you were disappointed," Frank said, trying to keep his tone even. "But that doesn't excuse sabotage. Someone could have been killed." Carter stared at him, his eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. "I didn't do it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I wouldn't do something like that." But Frank didn't believe him. There was something in Carter's eyes, a suppressed rage, that convinced him otherwise. He couldn't prove it, not yet, but he knew, with a growing certainty, that Carter was involved. "I'm going to have to ask you to stay home for the rest of the day, Ben," Frank said. "We need to conduct a thorough investigation." Carter didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face a mask of resentment. As he walked away, Frank felt a chill run down his spine. He'd dealt with angry employees before, but Carter's anger felt different. More focused, more dangerous. Back at his house, Frank tried to explain the situation to his wife. Maria. She listened silently, her face growing increasingly pale. "This is escalating, Frank," she said, her voice trembling. "It started with a strange box and a cryptic note, and now someone is deliberately sabotaging the plant. What is going to happen next?" Maria hadn't liked him taking the job at Beaumont Steel. She'd warned him about the plant's history, the potential for trouble now. Her fears were being realized. "I'm doing everything I can, Maria," he said, putting his arm around her. "I'm trying to find out who is behind this before anyone gets hurt." "Please, Frank," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "Involve the police. Let them handle it. This is too dangerous." He hesitated. He didn't want to bring the police into it. Not yet. He didn't want to escalate the situation, to draw attention to himself. But he knew Maria was right. He was in over his head. "I'll consider it," he said, knowing it was a weak promise. Later that evening, after Maria had gone to bed, Frank sat at his desk, reviewing the security footage from the plant. Hours of grainy images flickered across the screen. He'd scrutinized every frame, searching for any sign of suspicious activity. He'd found nothing. His phone rang, jolting him from his concentration. He glanced at the caller ID. It was an unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He decided to take the call. "Hello." A distorted voice, electronically altered, answered. "Enjoying your time at Beaumont Steel, Frank." Frank's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled, a chilling, hollow sound. Let's just say I am an old friend. Someone who remembers the strike of '87. Someone who knows all about your unfortunate past. He recognized the veiled threat. This wasn't about the plant. It was about him. What do you want? He demanded, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. Let's just say I want you to know that some debts need to be paid. The voice paused, then continued, its tone turning menacingly soft. And you wouldn't want anything to happen to your little girl, would you, Frank? The line went dead. Frank sat frozen, the phone clattering against the desk. His daughter, Emily. They'd brought up Emily. This wasn't sabotage. This was a personal vendetta, and someone who knew his past, was using it against him. He stared into the darkness, a wave of fear washing over him. He had to protect his family. He had to involve the police. Now, the gravel crunched under Frank's tires as he navigated the long, winding driveway. Old Man Hemlock's house wasn't a mansion, but a secluded cabin nestled deep in the Louisiana Bayou, a world away from the steel and grime of Beaumont. It reeked of damp earth and decay. The windows were dark, the porch sagging. It felt less like a home and more like a place where secrets went to die. Hemlock hadn't been eager to see him. Frank had to pull strings, leverage old contacts to even get a meeting. The old man, brittle and frail, opened the door a crack, peering at him with suspicion. "What do you want, Banning?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I wanted to ask you about the Mustang," Frank said, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace, "and about a box I found hidden inside it." Hemlock's eyes narrowed. He reluctantly opened the door wider, gesturing for Frank to enter. The cabin was sparsely furnished, cluttered with newspapers and dusty books. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and regret. "What box?" Hemlock asked, his voice barely a whisper. Frank described the steel box, the tarnished bullet, and the note, "Time is running out." Hemlock's face paled. He sank into a worn armchair, his hands trembling. "I haven't seen that box in decades," he said, his voice strained, "but I know what it means." He was evasive at first, speaking in cryptic fragments. He talked about a conflict, a decades-long struggle against forces that wanted to control Beaumont Steel. He hinted at industrial espionage, corporate sabotage, and a secret project hidden within the plant Tefty, something he'd called Project Nightingale. Nightingale, Frank pressed. What was Project Nightingale? Hemlock shook his head. "I can't talk about it. It is too dangerous. People got hurt. People disappeared." "But what does it have to do with the Mustang, the box?" "The Mustang was a safe house," Hemlock said, his voice barely audible. "A place to store sensitive information. I used it to document everything I discovered." Frank leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What did you discover?" Hemlock hesitated, then sighed. "Financial irregularities, embezzlement, illegal shipments. I started digging, asking questions, and then they came after me." "Who came after you?" "People in suits, men with no names. They framed me, accused me of mismanagement, forced me into early retirement. They wanted me silenced." He pointed a bony finger at Frank. "You need to be careful, Banning. You're poking around in things you don't understand. Some stones are best left unturned." Frank pressed him for details, but Hemlock clammed up, refusing to say more. He'd said too much already, he claimed. He was a broken man, haunted by the ghosts of his past. Frank left the cabin feeling frustrated and unsettled. Hemlock's warnings were ominous. He'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a disgruntled employee and a few sabotaged machines. Meanwhile, Sal had been working his own angle. He'd been discreetly questioning his contacts on the factory floor, piecing together information about the recent events, and the plant's future prospects. He met Frank at a diner near the plant, his face grim. "I think I found something," Sal said, sliding a folder across the table. "The plant is bidding on a massive contract with the Department of Defense, a multi-billion-dollar deal to manufacture specialized steel components for a new generation of military drones." Frank opened the folder, scanning the documents. Sal had compiled a report outlining the contract details, the competing bidders, and the potential financial rewards. "This could save the plant," Frank said, his voice laced with cautious optimism. "This could mean hundreds of jobs. That is what they want you to think," Sal said, his voice low. "I've been hearing whispers someone is trying to sabotage the bid. Disrupt production, create safety concerns, make the plant look unreliable." "Carter?" Frank asked. "Maybe," Sal said. "But I think it goes higher up. Someone wants to make sure Beaumont Steel doesn't get that contract. Someone who stands to profit from our failure." Frank felt a cold dread creeping over him. The sabotage wasn't just about revenge. It was about money, power, and a high-stakes game with potentially devastating consequences. He started making calls, contacting his contacts within the Department of Defense, trying to get a sense of the bidding process. He discovered that Beaumont Steel was the frontrunner, but that a rival company, Sterling Technologies Sibin, was mounting a fierce challenge. Sterling Technologies had close ties to several influential politicians and a reputation for playing dirty. Back at his house, Frank tried to focus, to make sense of the fragmented pieces of information. He went over everything again: the Mustang, the box, Hemlock's warnings, the sabotage, the Dodd contract. It was a tangled web of intrigue and deception. He was just about to turn in for the night when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. He opened it, his heart sinking as he saw the image. It was a photograph of his house, taken from across the street, partially obscured by the branches of a tree. The photo was clear, detailed. It showed his living room window, illuminated by the soft glow of the television, and standing in the shadows, barely visible, was a figure. Watching the figure was too distant to identify. But Frank knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was being actively monitored. The threat wasn't just to the plant or his career. It was to his family, and the people behind it were escalating. The factory died a slow, agonizing death. It started with a flicker, a momentary dip in power, then a cascade of failures. First, the robotic welders seized, their arms frozen mid-motion. Then the automated paint booth sputtered and died, leaving half-finished chassis streaked with color. Within an hour, the entire assembly line ground to a halt, a monstrous metal beast brought to its knees. Frank raced through the chaos, his gut twisting with each new report. It wasn't random malfunctions this time. It was coordinated, targeted. Every critical system was down simultaneously. "What is happening?" Rodriguez shouted, her voice barely audible above the din of alarms and frantic shouts. "They're hitting us from every angle," Frank replied, his voice grim. "This isn't just sabotage anymore. It is a full-scale assault." He ordered an immediate lockdown, no one in or out. He needed time to assess the damage and figure out what the hell was going on. The initial assessments were damning. The sabotage wasn't aimed at crippling the plant indiscriminately. It was focused on a specific component, the high-strength alloy steel chassis sind, the very component Beaumont Steel was contracted to produce for the Department of Defense. The alloy making process had been subtly altered, the integrity of the steel compromised. It wouldn't fail instantly, but it would fail catastrophically under stress, rendering the components unusable. Someone wasn't just trying to disrupt production. They were trying to disqualify Beaumont Steel from the contract. "It is the Dodd contract," Frank muttered, realizing the horrifying truth. "They want to ensure Sterling Technologies gets it." He immediately contacted Sal, instructing him to dig deeper into Sterling Technologies' connections, their lobbying efforts, anything that might reveal their involvement. Following a hunch, Frank retraced his steps from the previous days, revisiting the areas where he'd noticed the initial signs of tampering. He remembered Hemlock mentioning a hidden access panel, a forgotten utility corridor from the plant's original construction. Finding it wasn't easy. Buried behind a stack of obsolete equipment, concealed behind a false wall, it was a relic of a bygone era. The corridor was narrow, claustrophobic, and reeked of dust and decay. It led him to a small, unmarked room hidden deep within the plant's infrastructure server room that didn't appear on any of the official blueprints. Inside, bathed in the eerie glow of blinking monitors, sat Ben Carter. He was hunched over a keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys, lines of code scrolling across the screen. "This is where you've been hiding," Frank said, his voice cold. Carter didn't bother to look up. He continued typing, his face illuminated by the monitor's light. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice flat. "Eventually. You did this, didn't you? You sabotaged the plant." Carter finally turned around, his eyes burning with a mixture of resentment and desperation. "I didn't have a choice." "What are you talking about?" "They have my family banning," Carter said, his voice cracking. "They threatened them, my wife, my kids. They said if I didn't do what they wanted, they'd pay the price." "Who threatened you?" Frank demanded. "Arthur Penhaligon," Carter said, his voice barely a whisper. "Former VP of Operations at Sterling Technologies. He was forced out a few years ago, but he still has connections. He wanted Beaumont Steel to lose that contract. He said it was a matter of national security." The irony wasn't lost on Frank. National security used as a justification for corporate sabotage. "He blackmailed you." Carter nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "He knew about my gambling debts. He had people following me, documenting everything. He said he'd expose me, ruin my life. Unless I helped him." Frank lunged for Carter, grabbing him by the arm. "You should have come to the police." "The police?" They wouldn't have understood. They would have just dismissed it as disgruntled worker syndrome. "Penhaligon's got friends in high places. Banning. He is untouchable." Carter wrenched his arm free, scrambling to his feet. "You don't understand what I've been through. I just wanted to protect my family." The room erupted in chaos. Frank and Carter grappled, exchanging blows. Carter was surprisingly strong, his movements fueled by desperation and fear. They crashed into a server rack, sending monitors tumbling to the floor. Sparks flew as wires snapped. Frank shouted, trying to subdue Carter. "You're making things worse." Carter broke free, knocking Frank to the ground. He scrambled towards the door, intent on escaping. Frank lunged again, tackling him just as he reached the exit. They wrestled their way out of the server room and into the main corridor, their fight drawing the attention of security personnel. The struggle led them towards the factory's main power grid, a dangerous maze of transformers and high-voltage cables. Just as Frank managed to gain the upper hand, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a text message, a photograph. It showed his house, again, but this time the photo wasn't taken from across the street. It was taken inside his living room, a remote security camera feed, hijacked and displayed on his phone. And in the frame, he saw his wife, Maria, and his daughter, Sophia, standing near the window, looking frightened. A voice crackled through the phone, distorted and menacing. "Banning, or your family pays the price." Frank froze, his blood turning to ice. He knew this wasn't just about the plant or the contract. It was about control, about making an example of him. He knew Penhaligon was calling the shots. Carter, sensing Frank's hesitation, saw his chance to escape. He broke free and fled into the darkness, disappearing into the maze of the factory floor. Frank stood there paralyzed, staring at the image of his family on his phone. The weight of his predicament crashed down on him. He had to protect them. He had to find a way to stop Penhaligon, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Carter's voice echoed in his ears, a chilling afterthought. It is not just about the contract banning. That was just phase 1. He paused, a sinister chuckle resonating through the line. Phase 2 is much more permanent. The wrench felt slick in Frank's hand, the metal cold against his sweat. Carter, eyes gleaming with manic energy, was already at the main breaker panel, wrestling with the emergency shutdown override. Sparks showered as he forced the mechanism. Each snap and crackle was a hammer blow against Frank's chest. He moved too slowly, hampered by the throbbing in his ribs, the ache in his shoulder. He'd underestimated Carter. He'd underestimated how far a man would go, fueled by desperation and spite. Carter, stop. Frank's voice was ragged, barely a shout over the rising whine of failing machinery. Carter didn't even glance back. This plant deserves to burn. All of you, living fat and happy while the rest of us struggle. Frank lunged, adrenaline overriding the pain. He slammed into Carter's back, knocking him off balance. They grappled, a desperate, clumsy struggle within the cramped electrical room. Carter smelled of stale coffee and something else, something metallic and acrid. Fear. Frank tasted it on the air. Carter, surprisingly strong, threw Frank off, sending him crashing into a bank of control panels. Alarms shrieked, red lights strobed, turning the room into a chaotic nightmare. Frank scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp sting in his elbow. He had to reach Carter before he completed disabling the failsafes. The automated systems were designed to prevent a chain reaction, a total systems collapse. Without them, the whole plant could go critical. He saw Carter reaching for a final set of wires, the ones controlling the cooling system's redundancies. If those went, the reactor core would begin to overheat. It wouldn't be Chernobyl, not exactly. But it would be a disaster, a localized catastrophe that would devastate the town and bury the plant Sivanti and his career under a mountain of blame. Frank charged, swinging the wrench with everything he had. He connected, a dull thud against Carter's temple. Carter staggered, his grip loosening on the wires. Frank didn't hesitate. He wrestled the wrench free, shoving Carter away, then slammed the override switch back into its neutral position. The whine of the machinery began to subside, replaced by a shuddering groan as the backup systems kicked in. The red lights flickered, then dimmed. Slowly, agonizingly, the alarms began to fall silent. Frank stood over Carter, chest heaving, the wrench trembling in his hand. Carter was on the floor, groaning, clutching his head. He looked defeated. Why? Frank managed to rasp, his voice thick with exhaustion. Why do this? Carter's reply was a mumbled, incoherent string of accusations. Something about promises broken, about a poisoned deal, about being left behind. Frank didn't bother trying to understand. It didn't matter anymore. He'd stopped it. He'd saved the plant, for now. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each second. They'd been called. Sal had seen to that, the moment Frank radioed for help. Frank backed away from Carter, leaning against the control panel for support. His body screamed in protest. He felt old, broken, but alive. The plant's security team arrived first, followed moments later by the local police. They swarmed the electrical room, securing Carter and beginning the preliminary investigation. Frank, after giving a brief statement to a young, earnest officer, was allowed to sit, to catch his breath. Sal found him a few minutes later, his face etched with relief. "You okay, Frank?" They said Carter really went for it. Frank nodded, wincing as he tried to move his shoulder. "I'll live, just tired. The plant, it is bad but manageable. We caught it in time. The emergency systems held. You saved us, Frank. You really did. Sal clapped him on the back, a little too enthusiastically. Frank grimaced. Carter's talking, Sal continued, lowering his voice. He is laying it all out. He named names, says he was working with Richard Harding. Richard Harding, the former VP of Operations, the man who'd been forced out 6 months ago after a messy internal investigation. The man who'd constantly undermined Frank's efforts to modernize the plant. The man who'd made it abundantly clear he believed Frank was in over his head. Harding, Frank repeated, his voice flat. What is Harding got to do with this? Carter claims Harding promised him a hefty payout if he could sabotage the plant, make it look like a safety issue, discredit the new contract. Harding's been whispering about the contract for months, saying it was a disaster waiting to happen. This was supposed to prove him right. It made a horrifying kind of sense. Harding, still bitter about his dismissal, using Carter as a pawn in a twisted game of revenge. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it explained so much. The timing, the precision of the sabotage, the deliberate targeting of the new safety systems. The police are already looking into Harding's finances, his contacts, Sal said. They're pulling records, issuing subpoenas. It is going to be a full-blown investigation. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The plant remained partially shut down. Production limping along at a fraction of its normal capacity. Teams of engineers and technicians worked around the clock to repair the damage, to restore the systems to their full functionality. Frank, despite his injuries, was thrown into the middle of it all, coordinating the effort, answering questions, providing statements. The new contract hung in the balance. The union, initially furious about the near disaster, was placated by Carter's confession and the evidence pointing to Harding. But the company was already looking for ways to renegotiate, to scale back the concessions. Frank knew he had to fight to protect what they'd won. The workers' jobs, their livelihoods, depended on it. The police investigation into Harding moved quickly. They discovered a series of offshore accounts, linked to shell corporations that appeared to have been used to funnel money to Carter. They uncovered emails and text messages detailing Harding's scheme, his instructions, his promises of reward. Harding denied everything. Of course, he claimed he was being framed, that Carter was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was arrested on charges of sabotage, conspiracy, and fraud. Frank found a grim satisfaction in Harding's downfall. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He'd faced down a threat to the plant, protected his workers, and exposed a corrupt executive. He'd done his job, but a nagging feeling of unease remained. Something didn't quite add up. The deeper the police dug into Harding's affairs, the more questions arose. Harding was a ruthless, ambitious man. Yes. But he wasn't a genius. He wasn't capable of orchestrating a plan this complex, this meticulously executed. He lacked the technical knowledge, the network of contacts, the sheer audacity to pull it off on his own. Frank voiced his concerns to Sal during a rare quiet moment in his office. It is too clean. Sal, Harding's a scapegoat. He was used. Someone else was pulling the strings. Sal sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. Frank, we've got Harding. He is the one who paid Carter, who organized the sabotage. What more do you want? I want to know who Harding was working for, who benefited from this. The money trail leads to Harding, but it doesn't end there. There is something bigger going on. I can feel it. Sal shook his head. You're letting your paranoia get the better of you, Frank. You've been through a lot. You need to rest. Frank didn't argue. He knew Sal was right, to an extent. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. He felt like they'd extinguished a fire, only to discover the embers were still glowing, hidden beneath the ash. He'd been reviewing the security logs from the night of the sabotage, searching for any anomalies, any overlooked details. He focused on the entry and exit records, the movements of personnel, the timestamps of various events. Then he found it. A brief, encrypted message sent through the plant's internal communication system, routed through Harding's terminal, just hours before the sabotage began. It wasn't a long message, just a few lines of coded text. The police had dismissed it as another piece of Harding's evidence, but Frank's gut clenched. He showed it to Maria, the plant's IT specialist, a sharp, resourceful woman with a knack for cracking codes. She worked on it for hours, running it through various decryption algorithms. Finally, she looked up, her face pale. "I think I've got it, Frank," she said, her voice trembling. "It is a simple cipher, a substitution code. But the message, it is unnerving." She handed him a printed copy of the decrypted text. It read, "The gears are turning. Phase 2 initiated. The harvest begins." Frank stared at the message, a cold dread creeping into his heart. The gears are turning. Phase 2. The harvest begins. What did it mean? Who was sending these messages, and what was the harvest? He looked back at Maria, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you have any idea who sent this?" Maria shook her head. "The message was routed through Harding's terminal, but the origin is masked. It came from somewhere outside the plant, using a series of proxy servers. It is like a ghost in the machine." A ghost in the machine, a puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. They'd stopped Carter, arrested Harding, but the real enemy was still out there, lurking, waiting, planning the next move. And as he looked at the cryptic message, he knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was far from over. The aftershocks had only just begun. The dust was settling, but the scent of burnt metal and regret still clung to Beaumont Steel. Production had resumed, albeit at a reduced capacity. The Dodd contract, miraculously, hadn't been rescinded, but the plant's reputation had taken a beating. Frank walked the floor, nodding to workers, offering what encouragement he could. It felt less like a victory and more like a temporary reprieve. The police investigation into Arthur Penhaligon had been swift and thorough. Carter's full confession, coupled with the digital evidence recovered from the hidden server room, had been enough to secure an indictment on charges of industrial sabotage, blackmail, and conspiracy. Penhaligon, predictably, denied everything, claiming he was a victim of a politically motivated smear campaign. But the evidence was overwhelming. However, something didn't quite sit right with Frank. The whole thing felt too neat. Penhaligon was a ruthless businessman, certainly, but he lacked the resources and the reach to orchestrate something of this magnitude on his own. He was a pawn, Frank realized, a useful idiot in a much larger game. He'd spent the last few days meticulously combing through financial records, cross-referencing company filings, and following the money. He'd started with Sterling Technologies, then branched out, tracing investments and donations. He'd reached a dead end more than once, encountering layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts designed to obscure the truth. Then he found it, a subtle, almost insignificant transaction, a $50,000 contribution from a Sterling Technologies subsidiary to the re-election campaign of Councilman Earl Beaumont Sifty, a local politician who had been a vocal advocate for the plant, publicly, while quietly pushing for regulatory changes that would benefit Sterling Technologies. It was conclusive proof, but it was a thread, a connection, and Frank knew, instinctively, that it was a thread worth pulling. He passed the information on to the authorities, knowing it would likely trigger another investigation, but he didn't expect much to come of it. Local politics were a swamp, and Councilman Beaumont was a well-connected man. Back at home, Maria was urging him to let it go. "It is over, Frank," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Penhaligon is going to jail. Carter is cooperating. You've done everything you can." He sat at the kitchen table, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee. "I don't think it is over, Maria. I think we've only scratched the surface." "You're obsessed," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You're letting this consume you. We need to move on, for Sophia, for us." He knew she was right. He was consumed, haunted by the images of his family in danger, the weight of the conspiracy threatening to crush him. But he couldn't just walk away. He owed it to the workers at the plant, to his father's memory, to the idea of justice itself. "I need a little more time," he said, squeezing her hand. "Just a little more." The next evening, Frank attended a union meeting. The atmosphere was tense. Workers were anxious about their jobs, their futures. There was a lot of anger, a lot of fear. Frank addressed the meeting, laying out the facts, acknowledging the mistakes that had been made, and outlining his plan to improve factory safety. "We need to invest in better security systems," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "We need to implement stricter background checks, and we need to create a culture of transparency where workers feel safe reporting concerns without fear of retaliation." He faced some resistance, some skepticism, but ultimately he secured the union's support for his proposals. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It showed that even in the wake of betrayal and sabotage, the spirit of solidarity could still endure. The following day, driven by a restless energy, Frank found himself drawn back to Old Man Hemlock's barn. He wanted to examine the Mustang one last time, to see if he'd missed anything. The barn was eerily silent, the air thick with dust and shadows. He ran his hand along the Mustang's sleek curves, admiring its lines. He'd spent hours poring over the car in the days following his initial appraisal, trying to unlock its secrets. He found himself focusing on the glove compartment, meticulously checking every seam, every panel. And that is when he noticed it, a small, almost imperceptible indentation on the underside of the compartment door. He ran his fingers over it, revealing a faint outline, an insignia. It was a stylized V intertwined with a pair of wings, an emblem he'd seen before, years ago in an old automotive history book. The Van Dalen crest. The Van Dalen family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the automotive industry, a dynasty with a long and storied history, but also a reputation for ruthless ambition and shadowy dealings. They owned sterling technologies. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered reading about the Van Dalens, their vast holdings, their influence in Washington, their willingness to do whatever it took to maintain their dominance. The sabotage, Penhaligon, the contract. It all started to fall into place. The Van Dalens hadn't wanted just a contract. They wanted to eliminate the competition, to consolidate their power. He opened the Mustang's door, sliding behind the wheel. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, filling the barn with its throaty rumble. He sat there for a moment, listening to the engine, lost in thought. He'd uncovered a conspiracy, brought down a corrupt executive, and saved the plant. But he knew, with a growing sense of dread, that he'd only peeled back the first layer of a much larger, far more dangerous game. The Van Dalens weren't going to let this go. They wouldn't allow someone like him, a blue-collar plant manager, to threaten their empire. He shut off the engine, the silence descending once more. He looked out the barn door, into the gathering dusk. He saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. He didn't recognize the car, but he knew with a certainty that sent shivers down his spine that he was being watched, and he realized with a chilling clarity that he'd just stepped into a world where the rules were different, where power trumped justice, and where the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer just protecting a factory. He was caught in a web spun by shadows, and the spider was watching him, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike.